Hey friends, Bob Turner here. Recently, I used a newsletter that I have footnotes, curated resources for ministers. I sent out to a bunch of scholars I know and said, here's what I need to hear from you. I want to know who your Mount Rushmore is. I want to know who are the people in your field, biblical, religious, theological studies, who are the big four? Who are the people who have been most significant in your walk and in your faith and in your reading and your expertise and all of that? So we got about 20 scholars. They responded and they said, okay, here's my four. I published it last week and we have those findings, but I didn't want to talk about that by myself. So I brought on my friend, Harding University, Mac Sandlin. Hey, Mac, what's going on?
Hey, Bob. Not a lot, just reading a lot of books and trying to teach online.
We're all in new times here, and hopefully this content today will kind of give you something else to chew on besides the anxiety of learning to teach online.
Sure.
And all of this stuff going on here. Here we go, Mac. You were one of the respondents. Who did you say?
You know, I think I said Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, and then I sat around and like dithered and worried over who the last one should be.
And you went with Athanasius.
Athanasius. Sorry.
Big kind of Nicene Christology guy.
I do believe in Christ, and I do like the Council of Nicaea.
So it's interesting. A lot of people enjoyed reading these. One thing, a few observations we found, and you may have been one of these people, but people hated being told it had to be just for people, which is the idea of a Mount Rushmore. And they also wanted to tell me, almost half the responses would write to me and say, now I need to give you some caveats about this list.
Right. Yeah, I didn't do it, but I wanted to.
Yeah, which is like Teddy Roosevelt's on Mount Rushmore. You know what I mean? And it's like the first three on Mount Rushmore, you're like, okay, Washington and Abraham Lincoln, right? And then it's Thomas Jefferson. And then Teddy Roosevelt. And so you've got like these three people who I think most people would say like, okay, you got the three. And then it's Teddy Roosevelt, which there's a problem with Teddy Roosevelt, but when you put Teddy Roosevelt on there, like you invite a set of arguments that you weren't anticipating.
Right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Right. And nobody probably would have said anything if it was a Mount Rushmore of three people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And so it is interesting that like if you give a person four, they want to give you five, and then if I would have said give me five, they would have wanted to give me six.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was this caveat. So like number one, the numbering just really messed with people, and then also there was this idea of like, well, do you just want it to be Bible, or do you just want it to be theology, or is this supposed to be people that other people care about, or is this just personal to me? And I realized like, man, we're in a tough bunch here. We're so fine and critical. We don't really want to say the wrong thing. And so I understand the specificity, but it's kind of a fun way to think about how our minds work. What was your process when I sent this to you?
Well, you know, I was thinking about like the language of Mount Rushmore was new to me. I like that movie High Fidelity. And so I was thinking in terms of top five. And so when I teach, I go, here are the five most significant theologians in the history of the world, blah, blah, blah. Or I would say after the biblical writers, you know, here are the top five. So then to be moved to four was harder. And so for me, I was thinking in terms of like the biggest impact. So Calvin's on my list, despite the fact that I'm like fairly passionate in my antipathy for Calvin. But his genius is undeniable. His influence is undeniable. So when I got to reading the published list and I saw some people putting, you know, like, I don't know, there were contemporary Church of Christ people on the list that I thought, oh, they're talking about like, who was it for them? So if I'm picking like the most influential in my life, I don't pick Athanasius, Augustine, Aquinas, and Calvin. I probably pick Augustine, Aquinas, Bonhoeffer, and Hauerwas. Or maybe C.S. Lewis, somebody like that. So yeah, I was thinking in terms of most influential in general in Christian theology. And I'd already made the caveat in my own mind, nobody from the Bible, because that's kind of cheating, you know.
Randy Harris mentioned St. Paul.
Yeah, but it's easy to forget that St. Paul really is a great theologian.
He is. Yeah.
And if Adair, my friend Scott Adair were on here, he would say, you know, the greatest theologian of all time is Jesus Christ. who we all go, oh, but that's cheating. But it's not just that, like, oh, he's divine and he performs, the heart of the faith. He also, his reflections on God, like how he thinks and talks about God in the Sermon on the Mount. Oh, yeah, he is actually a better theologian than anybody else, more creative, more interesting, so forth and so on. But sometimes the way we phrase those questions, like sometimes Scott will say, Jesus is the best theologian. And I say, no, he's just the best logian. He's just the best logos. It's not fair, but.
Good Theos too.
He's not bad as Theos. That's right.
And so all of us want to kind of make these caveats, like we don't want to give the wrong list. And I think that's the fun of it, is some people really personalized it. I mean, some people put like their professional path. And so it was like, this is my best undergraduate professor, this is my graduate school, and this is my postdoc or whatever. And like, that's really interesting. Other people went for people who haven't even lived in the past 500 years.
That was me.
Yeah. Let's make some observations here. There's some fun things. And so if you didn't see the list, we can give you a link and you can find that. But for those who did, so we have 19 respondents. There were 6 people who got mentioned there were 6 people who got mentioned 3 times. Okay, so this means that.
I knew who they were.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'll let you choose. Okay, so there were 6 individuals appeared on 3 or more Mount Rushmores.
Augustine.
That's one of them.
Aquinas.
That's number 2.
I think Karl Barth probably shows up more. I think he's probably got 3.
Number 3.
I think maybe because these were Church of Christ people, maybe Alexander Campbell. It seems like I remember seeing him. I'm guessing now.
Alexander Campbell appeared on 2.
All right. So who were the others?
N.T. Wright.
Yeah.
John Calvin. Walter Brueggemann. So N.T. Wright and Brueggemann are the modern guys, which is like the law, like you have one for the Old Testament, one for the New. I think those two. Brueggemann is the Old Testament, N.T. Wright's the New Testament for people who went to graduate school in the past 30 years, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, to our graduate schools anyway, for sure.
Yeah. And then Calvin, Aquinas, Barth, Augustine. So pretty good spread there, right? You've got people of kind of spanning the whole church history.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the big ones. You mentioned Alexander Campbell. He made 2. I circled here Church of Christ people who appeared. So we're going to count him. And we're going to say,
he barely meets the criteria. Don't tell the disciples, folks.
It was really funny because I looked at that. I was like, well, do we count him? He's kind of a disciple. And then I thought, well, he's also like a Presbyterian. So yeah. Here we go. You want to take guesses on Church of Christ people who appeared?
Campbell. I bet I can imagine an HST publication that Jack Lewis shows up on some lists.
Jack Lewis appears once.
I bet that John Mark Hicks maybe.
There's 2 Restoration Stone Campbell movement people who appear twice. John Mark Hicks and Alexander Campbell.
I love that. I wonder what John Mark thinks about that thing.
He's embarrassed if he's watching this right now. Tom Albright appeared. Annie Mae Lewis, my predecessor in the library, appeared. Carice Berryhill, Jimmy Hinton, who Christine Parker put him. Kevin Youngblood, your colleague. And then we give half credit for Fred Craddock. I think he's like kind of has like a mixed story. So we'll take half of Fred Craddock.
Yeah, everybody wants to claim him.
It's true. And I thought that was interesting. So you could see people putting some of their own story. I have one that's a huge one that's missing. Barton Stone.
Nah.
Yeah, I mean, like, so you mentioned like whether or not
he's a big deal, but nobody sits around reading Stone.
I was going to ask you about this period because, like, all of us say, like, okay, we're part of the Stone Campbell movement, the Campbell movement, Campbellites, all of this stuff. And yet when people wrote down who their big 4 is, I don't think there was nobody felt this urge to say, well, Alexander Campbell. I mean, let's be real. Most people in the Stone Campbell movement have not actually read Alexander Campbell.
Right.
So in terms of how we interpret the Bible, I mean, people like N.T. Wright have been more formative, right?
Well, it's a hard thing to say. I think that what happens with Campbell, and this happens even more with Stone, because we just don't have that much of Stone's writing. You know, you could read there's a lot of Campbell's stuff. Christian Systems actually a pretty fascinating systematic theology, though I'm sure Campbell would be horrified that I called it a systematic theology. But we have nobody reads Barton Stone's stuff, but that doesn't mean that Barton Stone's not still influencing us. He just influences us indirectly. And so, yeah, I think if you grew up going to Churches of Christ and sitting in Bible class with, Diana Raspberry was teaching me when I was a little boy, well, I might say Diana Raspberry or Larry Treadwell or, whoever the elders and preachers and Sunday school teachers were who were teaching me as a child. I know their names. What I didn't see as a kid was where some of these principles came from.
Yeah.
And that's where Stone does have an influence, even on me. I'm hesitant to claim Stone, because of his Arianism and some other things about him that bother me. But his influence is definitely present in my life and yours and in the life of the institutions that we are associated with. So that's a hard one too. Like Augustine more profoundly influences all Christian thinkers and writers and just Christian practitioners than N.T. Wright does, even if they've read 6 books by N.T. Wright and never read a book by Augustine, just because he shapes the lived experience of the tradition so profoundly.
That's how I feel about Karl Barth.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of really important people went to schools, and even if they went to places like Princeton and they were influenced by Barth and they had this, where it was like this Barthian emphasis, but I tried reading him. I did a project on him one time. I was exhausted. I was so tired during reading it. I mean, I admire people who can chug through that, but I'm like, the guy's keyboard did not have a backspace key. I mean, I'm just like, these sentences, they just go on in these pages.
Germans, man.
Save the rainforest, man,
He's great. I love Barth, and I do find him like inspiring to read. But yeah, the writing style can be exhausting for sure. And it's certainly true that the number of people that even an hour, like you as a librarian at a theological institution or me as a professor, the number of people who I know who've actually worked through the dogmatics, Church Dogmatics by Karl Barth is probably 1, 2, maybe I know 5 people that have done that.
I wrote on it one time. I think the professor gave me a grade of sympathy on my paper, like one of those, how like those degree of difficulty grades where the professor's like, this wasn't good work, but man, you really worked hard. Oh, yeah. I think that was that's what you get when you do this. Here's a few spots people, I kind of knew some of this, but I'll just make it like our crowd. And everybody I interviewed was not like exclusively Church of Christ, but all of them had some sort of like connection. We're not big into these people like British 100-year ago Charles Spurgeon types. That's just not our deal.
Yeah, for me, I think it's the Reformed, like Spurgeon and who are some of those other guys that like Reformed people would say you got to read,
like A.W. Tozer. People like he doesn't get mentioned.
I think it's the idea people. What's that? Like what original ideas do you get from Spurgeon, for example, or Tozer, or a lot of those kind of important figures in evangelicalism? Well, what they are really brilliant, really excellent ministers and preachers and promoters of Calvin's ideas.
It just hasn't been our deal. Hey, another one we left out. Not a ton of what we might call like the early patristics, right?
Yeah. I thought about some of those guys. Yeah.
Origen, Tertullian. That was not, I don't think that like allegories about the Gospels or something is apparently something we're reading a lot of right now, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true. The distance, makes a difference there. Though if I'm actually listing the most influential Christian writers, Origen has got to be in the top 5, top 3 maybe. He's massively influential, but he doesn't read because his ideas, I think, get adapted and I would argue improved by other writers in the tradition. We read them instead. but he sort of got the ball rolling. It's kind of like if you go to a psychiatrist or a counselor, they're very unlikely to like use Freud in their attempts to help you. Nevertheless, Freud got that whole ball rolling, even if a lot of his stuff has been sort of abandoned and discredited. Like Origen, is declared a heretic. Lots of his teachings declared false later on, but he still sort of invented this large work of kind of systematic theology that then was profoundly influential for other folks. I thought about people like Gregory of Nyssa.
The Cappadocian guys. Nobody got mentioned.
Guys. But it's hard to pick just one of them. They kind of, to me, go as a set.
People did not like, at least they didn't include, not that I'm not surprised by this, I'm just kind of listing, people who were critically influential in like English Bibles. When you think about people like Wycliffe, Tyndale, Erasmus, these sorts of people, that wasn't primary source guys.
Yeah.
Here was the one that was more of a sticking point that I think everybody wrestled with. That was missing, but we all acknowledged it was missing, and people all wrote in their emails, I'm sorry this is missing, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. But non-white and female authors. And so almost all of the ones I've received, people wanted to go with a Mount Rushmore of 6, and then they wanted to do an asterisk, and they wanted to mention that they do really like Gay Major Levine, or they really do like, and there was these things. And when you read the list, you can see some people did include. And my kind of takeaway on that was like, the reason we need to have conversations about justice and the reason we need to have conversations about including more voices is because this is what the list looks like. We don't need to patronize people by changing the list just to kind of make ourselves feel better, if that makes sense. And so the Reformation was not led by theologians who were
it. I mean, there's a sense in which history gets to dictate this. And if there's injustice in history, that'll be reflected in the reality. It's sort of like asking, who are the greatest military leaders in world history? They're all, these are dudes. And that's not to say that women can't or even in the past weren't gifted with strategic and military genius, but the opportunities weren't there. And so I think, the structure of the list simply reflects the history, and the history is colored by patriarchal societies and ethnocentric societies. Christianity happened to flourish in Europe, and it didn't happen to flourish in Japan. So, there aren't any Asians on anyone's lists, East Asians, because you didn't have that many super influential East Asian Christian theologians until later centuries. And even then, it's only just now coming about. Some great stuff coming out of there now.
I think in 50 years, the list will look so different.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. And really, I would say in 200 years, the list will look different. And that's one reason, like my list is Calvin is the most recent guy. We're talking 500 years before you get on this list. So like, I think Sarah Coakley's fascinating, and I read all of her stuff, and she's super cool and brilliant and awesome. And if Sarah Coakley had been, the one started the Reformation, then she'd be on the list. But it's just the historical realities dictate it. And so I would say the Mount Rushmore question is not who's worth reading. Certainly these 4 are worth reading, but they shouldn't be exhaustive. You ought to read some Asian theologians and African theologians and female theologians, and of course.
Yeah, I think that's where we are. So a lot of people wanted to say, okay, let's do Barbara Brown Taylor. Now some did make it into the list. Will Gaffney's there. Ellen Davis makes it twice, and I think that'll continue to go up. We just got to give this some time. But if you look at the publications, most of those publications are they're 20 years older or less, and so.
Julia Norwich is someone I think about. She's not particularly played this huge role in my life. But I think when I was at UD, a Catholic school, one of the things they would remind me is all the popes are European males, but tons of the saints are women from all over the world. And the saints are more influential. And so that kind of gets to some of the point I said earlier, like if I'm naming key influences in my own personal spiritual life, now the list begins to look much less like dead white men and more like probably half women, because half the people who've actually touched my life have been women.
Okay, so people are hearing this list, they're seeing this. This is like kind of intimidating. I'm a theological librarian. I look at this and I'm like, I don't have time for this. This is heavy reading. Uh, some of these things are just, like, yeah, this might have been good before Netflix existed. Help me out. Give a person who doesn't read classics, who doesn't get paid to take in this information. Let's think of an on-ramp, how to dig in, how to kind of familiarize yourself with some of the Mount Rushmore figures in an accessible way. Where do you start? What do you do?
Jamie Smith has a wonderful little book that just came out last year, 2 years ago, On the Road with St. Augustine. And that's a contemporary author writing in a contemporary, very readable style that's trying to introduce you to a classical author. And I think if Jamie Smith's book does its work well, it's not that you read it instead of Augustine, it's that you read it in order to read Augustine. Though I would say also of the people on my list, Athanasius is not that difficult to get a hold of, and he's very short. You could read On the Incarnation in a week very easily, and the ideas are profound. Augustine is harder, and his works are longer, but he's so beautiful. So I taught a class last year. I had a student who had read Augustine for a book review assignment, kind of, a forced assignment. And she said she really struggled for the first 50 pages. And then suddenly the penny dropped and just click. And then she wanted a whole class on it. And so she got together a group of 11, 12 people, and we taught a seminar class. And we just read probably, 800, 1,000 pages of primary source stuff from Augustine, and they loved it. I mean, it was a challenge for them. The first 3 weeks, they felt a little overwhelmed, but they loved it. I think that finding those popularizers is good. C.S. Lewis, incidentally, who's influential, but is like Lewis has maybe 1, 2 original ideas, and they're not what make him popular. What make him popular is his like wonderful summary and presentation of the classical ideas. I think he would be thrilled for someone to say, Lewis only had 1 or 2 ideas. We remember him for the tradition that he passed on.
His creativity and his way of working in people's imaginations,
yes,
far more important. His library, I saw it one time. I think it's at maybe, I don't know, I want to say Wheaton or somewhere like that. I can't remember where, but I heard a presentation about his library. But yeah, it was really slim in like biblical studies. Like it wasn't like he was sitting there chewing on primary text all day. He was kind of a different place. So
yeah, he's fascinating. But it was fascinating when I read Augustine with all those students, one of the things that they noticed was, oh, I know this idea. I'd say, oh, where did you learn that? Oh, that's in Mere Christianity, or the best bits of the Narnia books are either in the Gospels or in like Gregory of Nyssa, who Lewis read. And so it's fun sometimes to take ideas that from your favorite preacher, just like someone who grew up listening to, John Piper, and they love John Piper's preaching, is probably going to be excited when they read Calvin and go, oh, this is where that came from. So I think that's some of the like getting into classics is getting the right one or finding a good introduction. But the other thing I would say is I love these books, these old books, and I love ideas and I love reading. But I do find that in the internet age, it's harder for me to sit down and read long books than it was before I had a smartphone. And so for me, the trick is book clubs. I have a book club that used to meet before the coronavirus. We would meet every other week for breakfast. We just get up and meet at 6 and have breakfast. And we work through a chapter a time of some hard book that we probably wouldn't read on our own if we didn't have the group. But because we have the group, okay, yeah, I'll read it. Or we're reading Sergius Bulgakov's book on the Holy Spirit for the theology colloquy that I lead at Harding, which most of the members call pretentious book club instead of theology colloquy. So I think groups are helpful. I think good introductions are helpful. And I think knowing the ideas and then looking for their origin. Those 3 things are kind of good tips for getting into classics.
Bobby's and Circeus closed, right?
Yeah.
no longer existed. I'm sorry to hear that. That would have been your spot.
Yeah, we meet at my buddy Jeff's house or the coffee shop in BB. But Midnight Oil's got the Kibo room that's great for this kind of thing. Your kitchen table is great for this. I think these kind of things are great. And it's the sort of thing, even in quarantine, that lends itself well. Zoom like this with 2 people or 4 people is fun. With 40 people, it's not as good. But you could do a book discussion like this, just like you and I are chatting today.
I find my experience, I'll just say this, if I read a modern author, I feel like I can read fast and I can kind of catch up with it, but it doesn't sit with me as much either. Some of the older things, they're slower reads, but they kind of stick to my bones a little bit more too. Mm. And you kind of process them more slowly, because I think we read them more slowly because they do demand that we read them slowly because of the language and the everything is about them is different. So
good insight.
Hey, good stuff today, man. And if any of you watching this want the list, we'll leave you a link below and you can take a look and maybe think of your own Mount Rushmore. Hey, Mac, thanks for jumping on today.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate you.
Right.
Good to see you.
Later, man.